Ready to go? It has been famously said that the history of philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. The typical Marxist rejoinder is true, but Hegel is its final chapter and Marx its epilogue. Nevertheless, there may be significant problems with this view of history and in particular of the eclipse of philosophy. Although it is not necessarily unique in this respect, one thing that has plagued Marxism is the tendency to read texts, not for their own sake, not in an attempt to understand them on their own terms, but in a functionalist manner, as a means to a prior interpretation of historically specific social conditions, of which that text is deemed a mere reflection, and for which that text is expected to serve as confirmation. This raises the question, however, what does it mean to read a text on its own terms? To what extent is any theoretical system determined by the social conditions from which it arose? Can an idea be truly transcendent in this respect? Questions of interpretation are compounded when we confront, for example, Plato's unique dialogue form. Hegel, in his History of Philosophy, endorsed the idea that Plato's dialogue form is inessential, that it is sugar on the pill. This is an odd claim when we consider that one could easily turn the judgment around and accuse Hegel's highly formalized language, infamous for its abstruseness, of being like a bitter rind that hides the fruit. Certainly, there is something quite enthralling about Plato. When a Marxist reads Plato seriously, perhaps we know not whether we are beginning to ascend from the cave or are descending into a rabbit hole. Often, Marxists treat Plato as the archetype of class-determined knowledge. He is said to have provided one of the most elegant philosophical justifications for what is, in its essence, the viewpoint of the aristocracy. Nevertheless, anyone who would attempt to refute Plato in the same way that Dr. Johnson attempted to refute Berkeley's idealism must remember that for every stone one kicks off of the royal road to science, one will have to encounter just so many stones when, having been turned away at the gates of knowledge, they are forced to trudge back through the pauper's ditch. Now, I am unresolved in these matters. I have no horse in this race. Or, to use a more appropriate image, I am a charioteer with horses pulling in different directions. It is with this attitude that I, your moderator, pledge to be as impartial as I possibly can be, so as to facilitate a fair discussion between the horses who are in this race. And with that, I would like to introduce our participants. To my immediate left is George Carmenel. George Carmenel is a professor at York University and one of the best-known proponents of the political Marxist school of historiography, and, among other things, has published work on the French Revolution and the development of capitalism in England. Stefanos Kirkolakos is a student of the York University, and is currently engaging in an extensive study of Plato's Meno. He has also published work on the dialectical method in Marxist political economy. David Bedford is a professor visiting us from the University of New Brunswick. Along with extensive work on Plato's dialectical method, he has done work on Dewey's logic, as well as Marxism and First Nation struggles. At this point, I would like to just go over the format that we'll be using today and to give you a time frame of what's going to occur. So first, I've asked each of the participants to basically spend 5 minutes in their introductory remarks answering the following question. What, methodologically, is the best way to read political texts, and, in particular, those of the ancients? After the 5-minute opening remarks, then we will move to the debate portion. Each speaker will have up to 3 minutes to speak, and I will be asking participants specific questions based on what they've said, or I'll be asking participants to respond to some of the things that have been said by others, or at any point throughout the day, one of the participants can put up their hand. I will put them on a speaker's list, and at the next available break, or according to the list, I will then give them an opportunity to respond. And I'll also be engaging with you if, asking you whether this particular intervention or question takes us in another direction, or whether it's addressing something specific that we are in the midst of talking about, and I will try to prioritize that so that we get a more organic flow to the conversation. I will be keeping time, and I will be strongly insisting on the time limits so that we have as fair and equal a conversation as possible. When you have 1 minute, I will indicate that you have 1 minute, you have 30 seconds, I will indicate that you have 30 seconds. And when you have 1 second left, I will indicate to you to please wrap it up. I consider each of you my friend, but for today, my only friends are Dike, the god of justice, and more importantly, Kronos, the god of time. And I will be serving them diligently. So I'm going to suggest that after about an hour and a half, we take a break, and then at that point we can decide whether we want to shift immediately into Q&A, in which the audience can participate, or if we want to have another half hour or so to wrap up the debate and maybe some concluding statements. We can decide that like a genuine polis at the time. Okay. Now it is time for the opening remarks, and the order I've decided is first George, and then David, and then Stephanos. Okay?
The school of thought that's referred to as political Marxism really grew out of the course offered by Neil and Ellen Wood. It will be 38 years ago, this coming September, coincident with their publishing Class Ideology and Ancient Political Theory. The course is The Theory and Practice of the State in Historical Perspective. And that is sort of a short synopsis of the methodology to consider in historical perspective the theory and practice of the state, and to relate those two. And this is something that is applicable to the whole of the history of political thought. And it's important that this isn't simply a question of historical context, as that is sometimes tossed about. On the one hand, of course, even somebody like Quentin Skinner believes in reading all the texts available at a time in order to understand the context of the texts. And, for example, his Foundations of Modern Political Thought, in 2 volumes, contains virtually everything but the laundry list of the monks of the Middle Ages. It's really quite an astonishing work in the extent to which it covers all of the texts that would have contributed to the thinking in the early modern period, and yet has virtually nothing to say about the society at the time. A little bit about the state, a little bit about politics, mostly about text. And that's not the way to proceed. In our review, what's most important is to understand why there is political theory. And in this regard, we are not shy in pointing out that Western political thought of the train of thought from the ancients in Greece to the present is unique. If you look at Chinese philosophy, you will not find a preoccupation with the question of who rules and how. And that fundamental question, who rules and how, with associated the conception that this is about the good life, as is very often put forward by the more philosophically inclined. Nonetheless, it's always in the context of asking, how is the rule of the state to be organized? And that is simply not something that has been an issue in other cultures. Why? Well, this is where the specificity of Western political thought is tied to the specificity of Western class societies. And that is really where we come in, trying to understand the ways in which the societies of Western political thought have been structured by fundamental relationships of power, political and economic, related to each other, and in particular characterized by the essentially central existence of private property in the hands of individuals and families as, at the very least, a counterpart to the state. And going back to their first publication on this, Class Ideology and Ancient Political Theory, Neil and Ellen Wood strongly made the point that if you look at the other ancient civilizations, you will not find the centrality or possibly even the existence of private property as you have in ancient Greek society. And therefore, it's beginning with the question of what makes the polis what it is, was, and how that existence in a political and economic context created the issues that necessitated the development of political theory, and then finally, how that political tradition was carried on and picked up, making what was said by Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates relevant to people 2,000 years later. And that is really the striking thing. The Greeks are not read for antiquarian interest. They're read to help us answer today the question, who rules and how?
Well, very much for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be back. The last time I set foot in this campus, in this department, was in 1985 when I graduated, and I vowed I'd never come back, but then here I am. And so I'm very pleased to be back, and it's Paul's persuasiveness that leads me here. And I also meant to mention to George before this started that I'm not an expert in political Marxism, and it would be unseemly of me to come all this way from New Brunswick to take on a debate on the specifics of political Marxism, one of the world's experts on it, so I'm not that rude or that bold. But I do have some things to say. Mostly my interest is in Plato itself, and I would be most happy to answer questions dealing specifically with the content of Plato's philosophical works, my own particular interest. But I will, bowing to Paul, direct my first comments anyway onto the question of methodology. As we are speaking of the book by the two Woods, it is an interesting book, but flawed in many ways, not the least of which is that the character of the question delimits the possibilities of what we can get from Plato and Aristotle, but my particular interest is in Plato. So that the particular approach that they take, and my criticism of it, is, well, my criticisms are twofold. One, I do not think that Plato was an advocate for the Greek aristocracy, for the Athenian aristocracy, and in the course of the conversation, I will, if you would like, I will present arguments to that. But secondly, and I think more importantly, is that the methodological approach that I would take can be summarized in the following. Really interesting political questions are not always political. And an excessive focus on the particular determinants of political questions can leave us blind to what are, one could say, foundational points, but more broadly, the kinds of philosophical questions which were the important political questions, the philosophical questions, which are the important ones for Plato and are still the important ones. In Plato's mind, the important political questions were ultimately philosophical, and the philosophical solutions he provided are the important political points that we need to take into consideration. That was true then, and I believe it is true now. What do we learn from the ancients? What can we learn from Plato? The kinds of answers which he was able to give to the philosophical questions which emerged from politics were a guide for his polis and are a guide for our state as well. And that is the particular direction that my own research has gone in on Plato and my own interest. So, as I said, just to summarize very briefly, the question, the methodological question about the connection between Plato and the Athenian aristocracy and so on, I don't agree with the argument in this text, but I think more fundamentally, an exclusive focus on that kind of a question hides from us all that is interesting and valuable in Plato, and that's what I hope to speak at least to some extent about that.
Thank you. Stefanos.
Hi. I have 10 points I wanted to begin with, but I don't think I will be able to fit them in 5 minutes, but that is okay. Also, I have an 11th point, a brief response to George Cominel, a 12th point, a brief reaction to David. There is no way they will fit, but let me start with the first one. When Paul proposed to me this arrangement, let's have a debate, and let's make sure that there is equality of time distribution, short time among the participants, not the participants, the main speaker, so to speak. And I agreed because I thought, well, some good is aimed at this distribution, which means avoiding long speeches. And I think it is good to avoid long speeches when you speak to other people. Because speaking in long speeches denies, in some way, the presence and the being of other people. But then at the same time, have you noticed that when you try to deal with one problem, in the middle of dealing with it, the exact opposite problem emerges? I realized that I have never been in a debate with this format. And I spent last weekend trying to fit some answers into 5 minutes. Within half an hour, I was completely frustrated and I gave up. So I'm not going to do it. I'm going to completely, of course, respect the format. But my answers will be incomplete. And I think this is fine with me. I mean, anyone who knows me knows that I am a master of the incomplete. I have to say something else also. The Greeks had a word about what we are doing today, and the word is klepsydra. In English, it is translated, unfortunately, as most ancient Greek terms, wrongly, as water clock. Originally, it was a sand clock or a water clock, and you know what it is like. But the Greek word means stealing time. There is something wrong with limiting time in which one can speak to such a short duration. Why is it wrong? Well, the first thing is, it's the game of the sophists. There was a group of itinerant teachers that most people today on the left and the right call philosophers, who specialized in the game of the clock. They were masters in beating the clock or beating the adversary in appointed, strictly predetermined and appointed time. The people who did not like the sophists at that time in classical Athens ignored the clock. They took time. Philosophy takes time, ignores the clock. The results socially can be disastrous. Look at what happened to Socrates at his trial. That's my first point. The second point, I just want to say that thank you for coming here today, and thank you for inviting me, because it is truly my privilege, and it is an honor and a joy to be here today. But also I recognize that you have taken time from other more interesting perhaps things, and I don't take either your time or attention for granted. And I already feel a burden of responsibility towards you. I mean, I already feel a burden of responsibility towards Paul, who invited me, and George Comninel and David here, but also each one of you, and it's a lot of you here. So I will try to be precise in what I do, but I need help because it's difficult being precise. What I will try to do is I will try to say things that are simple, small, and within reach, that can be dealt with in this room. It's very easy to speak, over people's heads. I have read the ancient Greek texts, probably more than most of you here, and I can speak about them in detail. It's really not a good use of our time together. That's my second point. The third point is I want to acknowledge George Comninel. George Comninel was and is my teacher, not only in the formal sense of having taken his state theory and practice of the state in historical perspective, something like 20 years ago, but also in a much more substantive senses, because he taught me things about teaching. He taught me things about learning. He taught me to love history, although I don't think I have done so to his satisfaction. And actually, he taught me things about character, and I know that time is running out, but these things remain. And although he and I have had some differences, which were expressed in somewhat hot-blooded way by myself, this is not what remains in me. And when time comes up, maybe I'll say something about that. But yeah, there's no use. I can't finish. So.
Okay, thank you. So it's at this point that I'd like to remind all our panelists now we're switching to, speaking of time, the 3-minute time limit on all subsequent conversation. So the first thing I'd like to do is ask you a question, David. What it seemed to me you were getting at is that often Marxists will look for what they regard as the most specifically political texts in Plato and try to understand the entirety of Plato through those texts, not understanding how some of what we might initially regard as the more philosophical and less political, what significance they have, how they bear on Plato's political teachings. And you also talked about one of your disagreements with the way that political Marxists, like the Woods, have approached the study of Plato. And so I'm wondering if perhaps you could give at least one example of, say, something that initially someone might deem as just basically philosophical in Plato, that actually has ramifications for how we interpret Plato's political theory in a way that would justify the criticism of the Woods.
Yes, I can do that, and it's going to be I'm going to talk fast to do it in 3 minutes. The overwhelming event, social, political, economic event in Plato's life was the Peloponnesian War, and he, like many Athenians of all stripes, were impressed in a negative way by the behavior of Athens, that it had behaved in a way, as the playwrights characterized it, even at the time, as excessive. So we see, for example, in Euripides' Trojan Women, a critique of the actual behavior of the Athenians at Milos. This is not lost on Plato. The political question which Plato then takes is we must be able to engage in political dialogue, in discussion, which allows us a judging standpoint, a critical standpoint, from which we can then pass judgment on Athens. That critical perspective, that judging perspective, is foreclosed by certain of the philosophical arguments which are made by the sophists. Plato is very keenly aware of that. In fact, briefly in the Cratylus, and as well in the Sophists and the Parmenides, but especially in the Sophist, he makes the argument that the Sophist denial of the possibility of falsity in one case and truth in the other. In the Cratylus, which comes out of Heraclitus, the capacity for truth, and in the Parmenides, his criticism in the Sophist of Parmenides, and the way that leads into sophism and the denial of falsity. He says these are the two streams which come together and have created an intellectual culture and a philosophical perspective which denies the possibility of any sort of political criticism. And in the absence of that, the polis is left with a politics of agon, of struggle, of contest, which in his mind leads to tyranny. The kind of tyranny which we saw in Athens in the immediate aftermath of the war. What to do? The answer has to be constructed philosophically, and that's what he does in 3 or 4 of the dialogues, most notably the Sophists and the Parmenides, especially in the Sophists. He constructs for us, presents to us, an understanding about how what in the Republic appears as the form of the good or the judgment of the good, how that is possible. So when we look at the Woods book, they elide over the passages on the form of the good. It's a bit mystical. It has a kind of aristocratic feeling to it anyway, without making the attempt to analyze in a careful and philosophically precise way what exactly is meant by that. This we can see by looking at certain of the other dialogues. Anyway, blah, blah, I'll explain it later if you wish. Plato's argument is that dialectics being the unity in his mind of the Parmenidean moment and the Heraclitean moment, the moment of fixity of thought, the moment of flux in thought, these two come together in what is the most fundamental philosophical category, the unity of the same and the different. And it is, in Plato's argument, it is this basis that we understand all being to be the unity of the same and the different, which allows him, I'll explain that later if you wish, the philosophical justification for the judgment of the good, which is the basis of all rational, dialogical, political order. Otherwise, you end up with agon and tyranny.
Okay.
That would be my example.
Okay, thank you. Now, George, wondering if you could perhaps respond to that, and if you want, talk about perhaps how you would, if you would put it in these terms, set up the relation of determination between his philosophy and his political ideals. It seems to be, in reading things like Citizens to Lords from Wood, that often the philosophical arguments around the forms have to do with a political position that he's already adopted given his class position. So if you want to address that in your response, you can. If you don't, that's fine too.
I think the key thing here is to recognize that neither of the Woods were particularly writing about Plato. And they do write about Plato, but it's Plato in the context of the Socratics, and the Socratics in the context of the Polis. I think that's really important. I've never liked Plato. I've said rude things about him to my students. And that's, I can elaborate on that if necessary later. But the key thing is, Neil and Ellen don't say rude things about Plato. And in fact, give a great deal of credit to him and his ideas. Sometimes when I read their work, I'm a little uncomfortable with the openness towards Plato that I find there, because I really dislike him. I don't dislike Aristotle. I see him as a worthy opponent, as opposed to somebody I'd poke in the eye with a stick, which is what I have said about Plato. The point here, I would say, is that there is something about the philosophy that is inherently political, in exactly the way David was talking about, and that has much more to do with the conception of the good, frankly, than it does with the details of political opinion. Because after all, the same guy wrote The Laws and the Republic, so where does he stand? That's not, I think, the key point. In fact, the key point is philosophy takes time, and only certain people get to have that time. And for Plato, largely, only certain people should get that time. And this is part of an entire view of the world which is associated with technique. The skills that we have, and only certain skilled people should rule, which I find fundamentally offensive. And so the point here is that one needs to understand how it is that Plato is coming to the conclusions that he is. Socrates instituted a very useful philosophical approach. I don't think either Socrates nor Plato were narrowly seeking to put forward a class political position. I think, on the other hand, that they did embody a political philosophy that was very much rooted in a class and very much associated with opposition to democracy. And by this, not merely democracy, especially not just democracy as a process, but democracy as the rule of and for the poor. And that is the reality of the classical age in Greece. There was rule by and for the poor, for maybe the only time in history.
Okay, so at least the purported claim that Plato is making a strict demarcation between those who are capable of ruling and those who should, and this is often reduced to the assertion, let the cobbler stick to his last, right? Stephanos, would you like to respond to either this or anything David
I
said?
have no concept of time, it's very tempting, but I didn't finish acknowledging George from Ninel, and I think this is important because it is important. It may appear that I'm self-indulging, but I hope that you will see that I'm not. George taught me things about teaching. There was something about the class environment that he had created, the energy, the participation, encouragement for all students to participate, to have a conversation, a debate from time to time, but also a conversation. His openness to hearing and commenting on ideas and thoughts that were not necessarily close to what he holds dear to his heart. He taught me things about learning. I have never met a person of such erudition with respect to being able to put political theory texts in historical context over vast tracts of time. It was quite extraordinary. But I think the most important thing that he taught me was a few lessons in character. because he accepted less than he deserves in a very, very major matter. And he did so freely and silently. I discovered about it by chance. There is a concept, this idea of bourgeois revolution, that the original take on this concept, that this is not a Marxist concept, although it is found in the works of Marx and certain Marxists, it is inherently liberal and it has certain ramifications which are not Marxist, and also it is not helpful because it is not true in understanding very important historical transitions. Somebody else, without acknowledgement, has taken credit from this, and George has said nothing about it. I think that in this, he in my mind, exemplifies the virtue of what Aristotle calls a great-souled man, a magnificent man. Not a magnanimous man, not a magnificent man, sorry, a magnanimous man. And I do not try to straitjacket George in Aristotelian categories at all. No, this came to me naturally and after the fact. This is exactly what I thought he did. Do I have 30 seconds left?
30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds left. A debate. Although it is an improvement of what happens in the classes of York University, is not necessarily the best thing that we can spend our times with. A debate, it's not simply a race, it's a contest. It can be a boxing match without engaging in polemics. I mean, we can keep a debate strictly on theoretical grounds, merits and demerits of theoretical arguments. We can do it purely logically. It's still adversarial, it's still a contest, and it's non-collaborative. This, I think, is a problem with it. And let me wrap it up by saying that in one of my subsequent points, if I get to it, I will like to make a recommendation for a more constructive form of debate, but I think that debate is something which is inherently detrimental in political ways too.
Okay, thank you, duly noted. So, David,
Yes.
you could come at what George says from an interesting perspective, I think, in that you have, you agree with at least significant portions of Marxism or Marxist arguments and worldview. I think at least you would loosely consider yourself as being part of that worldview.
Oh, absolutely. Not even loosely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And yet, you have what George would, I think, regard as a very sympathetic reading of Plato.
Terribly sympathetic.
Okay. So one question I have is, this has really been one of the focal points in Marxist critiques of Plato, and that is this question of the cobbler sticking to cobbling and allowing those who are naturally fit to rule to do so, as it's
Right.
articulated at least in the Myth of the Metals of the Republic.
Right.
Do you want to give your own interpretation of what Plato was doing there, and maybe tie in what you said earlier about how his philosophy bears on the political implications of that argument?
Okay, I'll try to do that. A couple of points. First of all, and I'll phrase these as both comments about Plato's understanding of democracy, but also to try to undermine in some ways the argument that the Woods are making that these understandings are pro-aristocratic. Unlike the aristocracy, who understood virtue to be something to be inherent as a result of birth, Plato was arguing that the virtues are teachable, that everyone is to be given the opportunity to be taught these. Not maybe everyone will end up having the capacity to do that, but the educational system he is proposing, and I don't think the Woods give proper credit to this, is radically egalitarian, not to be seen again for more than 2,000 years. Secondly, he argues that the virtues of women are the same as the virtues of men. Again, an argument not to be seen for another 2,000 years, and also not consistent with the understanding of virtue that one finds in the aristocracy. In many other instances, Plato is criticizing the aristocratic understanding of virtue. So, for example, the Symposium is a deconstruction of the aristocratic practice of pederasty. And it is the beginning, it is a dialogue, along with the Phaedrus, for example, in which we begin to see Plato deconstructing aristocratic understandings of virtue and of proper practice and substituting for them not democratic, but much more democratic and much more broadly shared understandings of political participation and of virtue. So that we find, for example, Plato arguing, just a casual observation, we find him arguing in the Statesman, what are the various kinds of constitutions and which ones are best. If there was an aristocracy of virtue, there isn't, that would be a good system. In the absence of that, which we have, democracy is best. Democracy is not the best by any means, because ideally, one would have an aristocracy of virtue, an aristocracy of knowledge. We don't have that, and so democracy is what we settle for as the best of the practical alternatives. Yes, on democracy, does Plato believe that everyone is qualified for rulership? No, he does not. He thinks it requires certain kinds of virtues which are cultivated through time and effort. I would point out that he is not alone in making the argument that rulership is not something which is, the capacity for rulership is equally distributed among the total population, and that the best way to proceed on important and difficult political matters is to allow everyone to have their say. Of course, Lenin neither believed in that. He also believed that on important matters, that particular kinds of expertise and study and knowledge were necessary for proper leadership, and that if the demos as a whole were allowed to go and to make all the decisions, things would go off in a different direction. And I'll wrap it up.
Thank you. George, would you like to respond?
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to point out that I wouldn't make more of a case for Lenin than I would for Plato on the whole. Some exceptions, but generally. But what I would want to say is that I don't believe that it is the view of the woods, it's certainly not my view, that Plato is essentially articulating a pro-aristocratic point of view. I mean, yes, the notion of the aristocracy of virtue is there, and he's not the only one who sees that. What is essential, however, is that he is anti-democratic in some fundamental ways. One of the points that the Woods make with respect to Plato is that in the Republic, his conception of the state is much closer to that of Egypt and of, in fact, the ancient civilizations that had no property, private property, and that were structured hierarchically, in which everybody had their place. And that conception is not what the aristocrats would have wanted. I mean, it wasn't an aristocratic oligarchy. And I think this is important. I mean, Plato is not, a talking point for the aristocratic point of view. His ideas are much more profound than that. I think in many ways, fundamentally profoundly wrong, but they are not simply, the voice of the aristocracy. And I think it's important to realize that the horrific political events that you were talking about after the Peloponnesian War, above all, the 30 tyrants and the terrible violence that they wrought upon Athenian democracy, was really a profound moment, and one that caused virtually everybody in Athens to have pause and to consider what would be right for the future. Socrates and Plato both had relatives and friends among the tyrants. But we can't say that they were among the tyrants. And I wouldn't want to say that of them. So I think the thing to understand here is that Plato's position is one that undermines the possibility of democracy in its real substantive form as well as formally, because he wants something else. And in a profound sense, he has seen the form of Western class society, and he doesn't like it. But he doesn't want to replace it with democracy. He wants to replace it with a form of society, if at all feasible, that would have no room for politics. It would simply be administered by somebody who is knowing. and where everybody had their place and kept to their last. Now, he would, in fact, I think, like the others who've come along, agree with a mixed constitution as better than many of the other forms, because they become so corrupt. But that's not to say he's pro-democracy.
Stephanos, now I am willingly open to any...
The axe is coming down on me, okay.
Just beside you. No, willingly open to any critiques of the format that we have today. But if possible, could you situate them through a critique of some of the things that you've heard today?
I didn't want to do it, but since I am asked, I'm going to actually, I'll try to fit 7 points, which are newly emerging points in terms of reactions, but very epigrammatically to George and David. George, I think you said in your opening statement something about in no other historical thought that we know of, for example, in ancient India or China, do we have anything equivalent, any preoccupation with who rules and how. Now, obviously, I've read very, very little of ancient Chinese philosophy, which I consider extraordinary, but I think that the Tao Te Ching, this founding text of Taoism, written by probably a mythical character, Lao Tzu, at least in half of its 100 and something articles, deals very specifically with rule, with what rulers should do. And it is not an accident that this text was dear to certain anarchists like Kropotkin and Emma Goldman. So I am not sure that, although there is something to be said about the specificity of ancient Greece, I am not sure that political theory as opposed to political thought, although in a different form, was totally absent from ancient China at that time. Then you mentioned, and actually both Ellen and Neil Wood developed this point to a significant extent, that there was something specific about ancient Greece in the classical period because private property was an institution so well entrenched and separate from the state that it was a unique context. Well, yes and no. Let me begin with the no. Ancient Greece in the classical times, not in the classical times, beginning in the archaic times, with the origin of the polis, was not unique. It was one of 3 parallel historical developments. The other ones were in Etruria and in Phoenicia. So we have the simultaneous archaeologically attested development of the polis, a self-governing community. Very, very small in scope, in 3 different geographies. And yet we have nothing in terms of political theory, at least nothing surviving, no indication that it existed in Etruria and Phoenicia. 1 minute. See, this is the problem with debates. It's speed. Speed is the problem. Speed goes against collaboration, goes against camaraderie, goes against learning, goes against education, goes against everything that is good in life. Speed, it's terrible. Okay.
On that note.
In Greece, not at all. Athens was unique. Corinth was the center of private property. Corinth, not Athens. The commercial center of Greece from the 6th to the middle of the 5th century. Yet there is nothing in Corinth in terms of political theory, of anything like that. So we need to be historically more specific if we want to take into consideration how social context and its specificity impacts upon the emergence of such oddities as political philosophies and so on and so forth. David has been speaking about Plato and what Plato thinks.
That's save it for the next round. It's time to wrap up. Sorry. I would like George to respond on some of the points that Stephanos has made, and maybe I think it's worth going into David. For example, you mentioned some of the political affairs going on that influence the thought here. Maybe we can also talk about the political economic conditions that may have influenced the kinds of thought that arose in this time. So I'll get George and then David.
Well, I'd like to say that it's absolutely correct that the concept of rule was discussed in other cultures, and the Chinese did it famously on a number of occasions, not only in the Taoist texts, but also Confucian. the thing is that that's not the same as addressing the question of who should rule and how. That wasn't addressed. And that is very much, I think, tied up with this fundamental question of property. And it is, I think, crucial that Corinth did not have the history of struggle over wealth and the reduction of producing free men, and we'll come back to that in a moment, to unfree status, and the eventual triumph of those free men as the demos that Athens did. And that is why I think that Athens is where, I mean, it was Athens that had the real struggle between the rich and the poor that framed the development of political theory, because the question was, should those poor people have any say at all? Virtually everywhere else, they had none. Through the actual practice of politics in Athens, they ended up having the predominant say, which was, as I said, unique. And here I think it's extremely important to consider, for example, Plato's commitment to equality and to women. One of the equality of women in particular. One of the things I would emphasize is that this was fundamentally subversive. Now, the fact that it was subversive, particularly with respect to women, is not something I want to advocate. I will, right off the bat, acknowledge that the democracy of Athens was deeply imperfect. But it was real, to the extent that what had happened is a situation in which poor free men were never in a position of power, acquired power. And the key thing here is precisely that this upset the world as it was supposed to be, in the view of many. And that's a good thing. What Plato proposed was not putting women in their place, but reorganizing the places in a way that, and one of the things I'll just say here is, the Greek Republican form, as generally is true of Republican forms, if you read your Rousseau and your Machiavelli, is predicated on the warrior citizen. And one of the things about warrior citizens is that they are historically male. And they tend to have very strongly misogynist societies. Look at Switzerland, the last society in Europe to give the vote to women. And culture that is itself really in some ways offensive and very masculinist. Nonetheless, it's associated with liberty, which is not a bad thing. It's the state that's bad.
Okay, thank you. And David, go ahead.
Okay. George, you said in your previous remarks that you were kind of mitigating to some extent the argument that the Woods are making about Plato as an aristocrat. And I would just say, as a part of the argument, that I don't think you've done full justice to the radicalness of their argument. In a section here entitled An Idealized Aristocratic Code, they write, Plato's ethic is aristocratic not only in the sense of the conditions for virtue, which are not so much conditions for the essential aspects of virtue, are peculiar to the life station of the aristocracy, but also in the sense that the virtues he extols are reminiscent of the more conventional aristocratic code of his own in other times. So it's not, I don't think, quite fair to the argument that they're making to say that they're not really arguing that Plato is justifying and speaking the values of the aristocracy. I think that's exactly what they're saying. And I think their argument, as I said at my opening remarks, misses on two grounds. One, that's not correct. And then secondly, what is missed is really the direction and tenor of the whole philosophical project that Plato was engaged in. So, if we look at his critique of democracy that he presents, the mitigated critique of democracy that he presents in the Republic, the point of the Republic as a text, and the point of his work philosophically, is to generate understandings, philosophical understandings, which allow for a refutation of sophism as a skeptical and subjectivist philosophy, and then to allow for public discourse, which is truth-telling and truth-seeking. His argument is that the only way to overcome the fundamental antagonisms and to overcome the imperialism of Athens, of democratic Athens, is to have a politics which is based ultimately on rational discourse. How is that possible? It's only possible, he argues, through certain kinds of philosophical positions, and this ultimately requires the refutation of sophism. So it looks like an argument against democracy, the argument being that correct political action, appropriate political action, good political action, truth-seeking political action has to be grounded upon the capacity of humans to arrive at the truth. This kind of political action can only happen with the overcoming of sophism. And it looks like a critique of democracy to say that in Athens, under the philosophical auspices of the sophists, we have nothing but a politics based on, as Thrasymachus would say, the interest and power of the stronger. It looks like a criticism of democracy to say that in Athens now, we have succumbed to the views of the sophist, and we have politics which is nothing but interest assertion. Plato wants to step away from that, and in failing to understand that this text is embedded in a much broader philosophical position, the specific point that he is making about democracy gets misread.
Stephanos?
I'm going to steal something from points number 8 and 9, which I didn't get into my opening statement. So why don't I give first a direct response to Paul's question? How should we approach methodologically the study of ancient texts? And I mean, one way of putting it initially is should we prioritize text or context? And it's obviously an oversimplification, and it's a false dilemma. But nevertheless, it points to a real problem. For example, to their credit, both Neil and Ellen Wood and George Comnenel never put it in terms of such a dichotomy. Although they prioritize context in a certain respect, they also emphasize at the same time the importance of the text. But let me just say why it is both a false dilemma in my mind and the real problem. Because first of all, we do not have the possibility to understand any single text without having at the same time to deploy some external information, external to the text about its context, be it linguistic context, intellectual context, political context. All of this information is very, very important. At the same time, we have absolutely no way of understanding anything about any context. Not even archaeologists do, in the absence of a text. So texts are paramount, both on the side of a so-called textualist approach and on the side of a so-called contextualist approach, including the social history approach to political theory that Neil and Ellen Wood have put together for us. And having recognized this, the presence of texts and contexts on both sides of this false text-context dilemma, we have also to recognize the multiplicity of the presence of it. There are many, many texts that we need to take into account, both in understanding a text, because usually, if it is philosophical, it will be comprised of several texts, and we need also several texts to understand it, but there is still a problem. And let me just say how to approach this thing methodologically is that I don't know. And if I don't know what I will do, I am going to ask those who profess to know. And here we have people who profess to know, and I have read some of them. I haven't read David's work, so I will be asking them. And I have already asked. I've done some of my homework. I have asked before I came here. How do Neil and Ellen Wood go about this social history approach to political theory? And because they will tell me. But let me go very quickly, 30 seconds. Okay, my other point to George, a couple of things. In Plato, you said before, there is no room for politics. Okay, this is my question. Is there room for politics in Marx's conception of communism? I read George's wonderful... Okay. I read...
That's a good question.
10 seconds, and then you can complete the point later.
Okay, later.
Okay. Thank you very much. George, would you like to respond to both Stephanos and David?
Okay. I think it's absolutely crucial that there is no room for politics in Marxist communism. The question is, what is the difference between Marxist conception of communism and any of Plato's, either, but especially the Republic? Here, one of the things, again, I'm coming back to is there's no real room for politics in ancient Chinese society either. One of the key things is that politics, in the sense that I used it and is generally used here theoretically, is about precisely the assertion of interest, as I think David put it. And the question of the assertion of interest is problematic, has everything to do with why the state exists. The state exists because of fundamental inequality, because of the appropriation of the labor of others in one form or another as forms of wealth, because of domination of some by others. That's what the state is about. There are no states, and there have never been states in the absence of that fundamental social inequality, and everywhere there has been social inequality of that sort, a state has emerged or it has disappeared. And I can get into, if you have a question, there have been situations where states have disappeared. So, the state is about preserving fundamental inequality. Plato's conception of a world without politics doesn't get rid of fundamental inequality. Some people are still working so that a philosopher king has time. Marx's conception of communism does not have that. Everybody has time. And that's the whole point. Not as much time as if there were other people working to support them and they never had to labor. See, that's what's wrong with the forms of society that have states. Now, it's in this context that we come back to the question of Plato's values. It's absolutely true that his values are in many ways fundamentally aristocratic. But that doesn't mean he's an advocate for the position of the aristocracy, especially not in narrow political terms. He's not advocating for an oligarchy, nor, however, is he advocating fundamentally for a society framed by the aristocratic values as seen by the aristocrats. He has absorbed much of the ethics and the values from an aristocratic perspective, and he re-articulates them in his unique way. And what he's advocating is what he sees as the best form of society, the good. Most aristocrats would not have agreed with him, right? But that's besides the point. It's in this sense that, yes, he's an aristocrat, but he's not a spokesperson for aristocracy. He's a spokesperson for Plato's conception of the good, which I think is fundamentally subversive.
In part responding to some of the assertions you had made, David, would you like to respond to what George just said?
Yes, I'll read another passage from the same section. To the point where it becomes difficult to distinguish moral judgment, Plato's moral judgment, from class propaganda. Propaganda in favor of the aristocracy. So I still think that you're significantly underplaying the point that the Woods are making. But I want to address specifically the kind of point that you're making. Marx, in certain passages where he waxes philosophic, and I say that as a Marxist, speaks about everybody will be, you know, in the best of all possible worlds, everyone will be doing one kind of task and then another kind of task, and no one will be specially privileged, and so on. And you hold that up clearly as a beautiful idea, as do I. And you say that that's not true about Plato. Fair enough, it isn't true about Plato, and it's not true about almost anybody else. I don't see, though, that one would dismiss as not worthy of careful study a philosopher like Plato, who I believe has many things to offer to us, even in our, even in terms of contemporary politics, even on contemporary politics on the left, because he didn't advocate that kind of equality. That's a kind of argument which allows us to dismiss the whole of the canon by saying he doesn't match up to certain kinds of standards. I remember years ago running into an old professor, and he said, "You know, what are you up to politically?" And I explained to him that I was at the time, as I still am, loosely associated with the Trotskyist group, and he said, "Don't you understand that Trotsky was a murderer?" as though nothing that Trotsky said was of any value because he was had certain personal qualities. Well, is every detail of everything that Plato said about politics something that we're going to grasp onto? No, absolutely not. Did he mean for us to, if what he proposed in the Republic, to be something like, this is what he sees politics as? Well, no, of course not. He doesn't think that there's going to be, these people, everyone is going to bow down in front of the philosopher. We philosophers can't run for politics and get elected. We couldn't get elected dog catcher. Obviously not. But it is a picture for us of how politics can be conducted under certain kinds of conditions. And these are certain kinds of philosophical conditions that if we are sensitive to them, both then and now, we can engage in a politics which is not simply a politics based on force. Because in the end, of course, even the politics of class struggle can't be ultimately engaged in solely on the basis of force. We engage in teaching about the class struggle, and we engage in it ourselves significantly because we believe that it is the correct position to hold. And Plato wanted to give us space, philosophically space, so that we can make the judgment that this is the proper way to live, and that this is democracy is the proper political form, and that we should be engaging in this kind of politics. He wanted to give us that philosophical space. And dismissing Plato because of the distaste for certain features of his imagined political world, I think forecloses to us a very significant and important opportunity to gain from him. And I'll wrap it up.
Stephanos.
See what's happening in a debate. I mean, ideally, I would have, and we would have the opportunity to have a conversation, a dialogue with George Comnenel instead of a debate, because he said something very important about the state and how it is preserved in Plato's, utopias or idealist, ideal society. But I would like to know something more about it, because I think one point that you make, George, in one of your recent works, Marx's theory of emancipation in the early works, I think, which was recently published, I think you make a couple of points, and you begin in a somewhat polemical fashion, no philosophy, but just historically grounded work. And yet you have some very interesting, not yet, you have some very interesting observations. I think that you take pains to emphasize that the state as such, any state, including all historical existing or having existed or past existing forms of states, is a form of alienation or a reflection of alienation. And I would like to know, but I don't have the opportunity now, but I will pose this question, if the state as such is a form of alienation, wouldn't this make politics as such a form of alienation? And so would there be no room for politics in a communist society? But and I would like to know what George says. But let me go back to some other points. I think you see, I find Aristotle difficult. I don't understand what he says some of the times. I find Plato far too difficult. And the difficulty is that I have no idea what Plato thinks. I mean, so many people do. But I mean, here I have someone, Plato, who doesn't help me. I think he has written about 30 works, and except one, they are all dialogues. He is not one of the characters in the dialogues. Characters in the dialogues get beaten up badly, including Socrates, in different dialogues, in the same dialogue. They switch positions, they say contradictory things, they use irony, so I have no idea some of the time what a character in a play, in a Platonic dialogue thinks. How can I know what Plato thinks? But so I would like to ask this question to David. How do you know what Plato thinks in any work, given that they are dialogues, that Plato is only mentioned twice in his dialogues? The first time that he's mentioned is that he is present in supposedly the historical setting, the actual event of Socrates' apology. What does he do? He offers money to the jury. Okay, take the money, okay, and go. Don't kill the man. They don't accept. They are deeply offended. So, you know, they still want him killed. And the second time is near the end of the Phaedo, supposedly a dialogue about the immortality of the soul. Does Plato believe in such a silly thing, the immortality of the soul? Apparently, because the character Socrates in that dialogue gives at least 4 quite developed arguments in favor of the immortality of the soul. What does Plato think about that? I don't know. The only thing said about Plato in this dialogue is that he wasn't present in Socrates' last moments before his death because he was sick. And this is what he wants us to know about it. I don't understand this guy.
So Stefanos has asked a direct question to both participants. The one about communism takes us a little further afield from what specifically we're talking about with regard to the ancients. So I'm going to ask David to respond to, and maybe we can come back to the maybe in
Alienation.
Yeah, we can come back to contemporary politics, alienation, and the implications for ancient thought for us. But David, why don't you respond?
Okay. Well, I think you're, insofar as you're saying that you're unfamiliar, uncomfortable with the particular debate form, I think you have pinned me against the wall with such expertise that I don't think that's true. You're asking me to say, as I'm speaking here on about the importance of Plato, you're now saying, how do you understand what is difficult to understand? Big mouth. You left that part out. And the answer is with great difficulty. I've been reading it, the first dialogue I read I was 14, and I have not ceased to read them yet. And I read as much of Greek history and other Greek philosophy and the plays and books like this one and books like the wonderful work that Ellen did on the class structure of ancient Athens and so on and so on and so on. And I think as hard as I can. And there it is. I remember one time as a graduate student, starting as a graduate student, one of my professors, I had read a book on hermeneutics, and I was extolling the virtues of hermeneutics, and he put me in my place. He said, "Is there really any difference between that and careful reading?" And I said, "No." Hermeneutically then, with careful reading, and then all of the failings that I bring and weaknesses that I bring to the text will show up in the thin and one-sided interpretation I'll end up with. That's it. I have nothing to say. Thank you, though, for pinning me like that.
Okay, George, go ahead.
Okay, one of the things I'd like to stress is that neither the Woods nor I think that Plato should be dismissed, and nor do we say that he's not worthy of study. I never took a course in political theory as an undergraduate, because I really disliked reading the apologists for the ruling class. And it was actually taking Neil and Ellen's course when it was offered for the first time, despite the fact that it was going to include political theory, because I was interested in historical issues, that I came to appreciate the importance of reading political theory and coming to understand what it is that is being said, and not merely to paint with a brush, oh, class advocate. And so I really do think Plato should be read, and not only to understand him as a bad guy, because in fact he is, I believe, genuinely struggling to articulate points about the good and the true. I may disagree with him fundamentally. My dislike of him has much more to do with style than his class position. I mean, if anything, Aristotle is more clearly an advocate of aristocracy than Plato is, but I don't dislike Aristotle the way I dislike Plato. So I just want to be clear about this. And it certainly is not the case. I think either of them should be dismissed, and especially not ignored. Then there's the question of alienation. And this, I think, is absolutely crucial from my point of view. I distinguish between forms of free cooperation, organization, administration, the emphasis being on free and collective, and the state. One of the key things that I've argued is that Marx is the first person in the history of political thought to have argued that the state in itself is a form of alienation, in the way that religion is a form of alienation. That is to say, it is the projection into, in the case of religion, I would say, a fictitious ether. In the case of the state, equally fictitious except real, the collective power of society. And that collective power of society can come and put me in jail, or kill me even in some contexts. Well, that's alienation. It is our collective power turned against us. And what I believe is absolutely necessary is for alienation to be eliminated in all its forms, but not least in the form of the state. That's why there should be no politics, because politics is about the expression of interest in the context of the alienated form of the state. It's not about debating whether or not we should do something because it's good or beautiful. That won't cease to exist. What will cease to exist is struggle over getting our share.
Now, Stefanos, I want to ask you to respond, but also one thing that I found quite interesting in my conversations with you, frequently you get people dividing the history of philosophy into its Platonic stream and its Aristotelian stream. And often there's this argument, particularly around the theory of the forms, about the great differences between Plato and Aristotle. For Marxists, often you get Marxists happily admitting this sort of Aristotelian basis of some of the fundamental presuppositions of Marxist thought. But that's never the case with Plato. And George, to a certain extent, also emphasized that demarcation between them, saying that Aristotle is a worthy opponent and Plato, although maybe you would soften that now, needs a stick in the eye. You have articulated to me that you think the demarcation between Plato and Aristotle is completely overdrawn, that in fact Plato is much more Aristotelian, or in a less anachronistic way, that Aristotle is much more Platonic than we are typically used to receiving them in secondary texts. Would you like to respond to that?
This is just a blow to the eye. I have a black eye because here I am, okay, having just said, I don't get Aristotle, I find Plato more difficult, and I have someone who is bringing information from outside, okay, personal information telling us that I have said to him, lo and behold, that I think that, Plato and Aristotle are almost one and the same, which means that I know, or at least I have let Paul believe that I know what you completely destroyed. I mean, really, my game plan, everything is completely informed. See, this is completely. And you are giving 3 minutes for this. Okay. So.
Well, 2.5 now.
Okay. But no, seriously. No, David, you're right. See, it is what we are doing, and the format is problematic. What I meant to ask you and ask you and hear from you, but you are right. I put it in the form of a debate. That was a blow, which I delivered to you. No. It was. I didn't get it at that time. I didn't mean it, but he's right. It was. Things don't work well this way. If you want the state to wither away, it's much more difficult to get the debate to wither away and replace it, let's say, with dialogue or conversation. It's difficult. We don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do it. But what I meant to ask you, and what are the, of course, I obviously completely recognize no personal hints at all, that you have been engaging in a very careful and long-term and thorough study of the Platonic text. What I was going to ask you, what are the exact interpretive principles, if you can help us understand them, which have helped you when you read, let's say, a Platonic text like a Republic or any other, to say that, well, in all of this mess that every character claims and disclaims here, this is what Plato thinks. And I can make this question more specific. So if it would be possible to have a way to understand what Plato thinks in the text that he has written, then we would have a way of getting rid of the dialogue form of this text, or basically of seeing through it transparently, because Plato is not one of the protagonists. He's the anonymous author. 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay. 1 minute. Egypt and the Republic. George, I don't understand how was it possible for you to say this. I mean, in Plato's, supposedly, in the character Socrates' city in speech, which is actually not the best, it's the second best, because the best was not accepted by Plato's brothers. So it's the second best. It's the feverish city. It's the sick city. But with a certain dose of medication, it can be healthy for a certain period of time until it collapses. It collapses. By book 9, it has completely collapsed on its own accord. 30 seconds, okay. So why is it modeled on Egypt? Because the so-called producer class will have private property. Private property is out of limit to the guardians and to the auxiliaries, not to the rest, the majority of the population. They can have private property, they can be merchants, landowners, slave owners, slaves, craftsmen. They can even, the character Socrates says, they can even legislate for themselves how they will organize their economic life. Was that a reflection of ancient Egypt at any time?
Okay, I'm not going to get lured in a second time about how to read Plato.
Okay.
Maybe later, maybe later. But I do want to address an important question which George raised, which is, he said the key focus politically is the overcoming of alienation. And, I agree with that. And on one hand, it is a practical question. And on that practical question, and on many other questions, but on that practical one, we can certainly look to Marx for guidance, and not to Plato. On the other hand, alienated practical life also produces alienated consciousness, as we know, and an alienated consciousness which is fundamentally ideologically riven. The expression of alienated consciousness, as we find it, for example, articulated in Hegel, is the one-sidedness of the understanding. The task of dialectics is to overcome this one-sidedness and to provide a speculative truth. Where do we go to understand this complex methodology which Hegel has provided for us and which Marx accepts? I argue that the clearest way, simply just pedagogically, how would we explain it to our students as they're working their way through these most difficult texts? I spent a year with H.S. Harris, going over the phenomenology, and I probably got an ounce worth of its wisdom. I began to make sense out of it by understanding the way that Plato articulates exactly the same dialectical problematic and the way he resolves it. Hegel was extremely influenced. In fact, Hegel really got his idea about dialectics as overcoming the one-sided positions of the understanding, and from Plato, and so does Marx. So, insofar as we are moving away from the simply practical question, the overwhelmingly important practical question of how one is to overcome alienation in practice, an important part of this process is also to overcome it in consciousness. And I think Plato can make a very significant contribution to that, as I said, in certain dialogues, partly in the Republic, but mostly in the Sophists and the Parmenides and various other. I stop there. Maybe I'll just talk for a second. How do we know what is Plato and what is not, and so on? The dialogues have to be read as a whole, first of all, not just individually, but as a whole. And secondly, he gives us a clue only, but a clue to how to understand them in the Parmenides, when he talks when he shows us, demonstrates us in the Parmenides the lack of fixity of any fixed determination. He's doing that. That's what he's presenting to us in a philosophically rigorous form, in terms of strict argument. He can demonstrate for us logically in the Parmenides that there are no fixed determinations. That all of these determinations that we make are, in the end, one-sided determinations. Why is that the case? Well, because being itself is characterized in Plato as dialectical, and so all of our metaphysical categories, all the categories of being themselves, must also be dialectical and contradictory, as it were. And so that's how we read the early Socratic dialogues. The early Socratic dialogues are explorations of this contradictoriness of fixed determinations.
I think this is an interesting direction to take it, talking about the dialectical method in Hegel and in Marx. I know that you thought a lot about this, George, and Stephanos, you've published on this, so perhaps, George, you could respond to David and then Stephanos.
Okay, well, I actually came to understand Hegel from understanding Marx, as opposed to the other way around. I have great appreciation for Hegel. I actually think an awful lot is made, and too much, of the dialectical method. I actually am a fan of careful reading. And I think careful reading leads us in the right direction. One point I'll make here in passing. Careful reading of Aristotle will show that one of his critiques of Plato was that it would require a society the size of Egypt for the Republic to be realized. What I'll simply say is, obviously, he's not describing Egypt, but I think the notion of a hierarchically organized society with producers and people for whom property is not an issue corresponds pretty well to what the reality of Egypt was. Now, in terms of understanding how do we go about changing the world, because that's fundamentally the question. Do we accept the world and make the best of it, or do we change it fundamentally? Here, the method is actually to diagnose what's wrong. The first thing to do is to understand what's wrong. Here, alienation is what's wrong. And alienation must be distinguished from anomie. So alienated consciousness is actually a very tricky concept. And I'm not certain I want to go down the road of discussing alienated consciousness, because alienation is, above all, the reality of not being in complete control of one's own self and life, because as a society we have erected barriers to that control through the projection of our collectivity into an other, and making that other real, whether in the form of a religion or most powerfully in the form of the state. And also property. Property is, in one sense, a matter of consciousness. If I own that land out there, I can't pick it up and carry it away. I can't consume it. It simply means that I have a relationship with you and everyone else, with persons. It's an interpersonal social relation by which I can say whether or not you're allowed to go on that land. A piece of the planet is subject to my talking to people about what they can do. I have no relationship with land. It just sits there. So what we must do is actually look at the way we structure our social relationships to see how they have been constructed as barriers to freedom. And I think Marx was an advocate of the emancipation of humanity in its fullest realized form. I think that reading Plato can be a very useful thing, if that's your preference, if it gets you to think critically. You know, Marx called for the ruthless criticism of all that exists. I'd start with Plato, but that's kind of besides the point. Ruthless criticism of all that exists as a way to come to understand what should exist instead. And I think David and I are in fundamentally basic agreement with respect to changing the world. With respect to Plato, maybe we don't agree so much, but I actually don't think our differences are as profound as they might at first appear to be.
Stephanos, go ahead.
Apologies, see? What have we accomplished? An hour and a half is gone. We have kept you frustrated and silent, which is both an undemocratic and un-Platonic thing to do. And suppose that we had a very adversarial but strictly theoretical debate, and I lost the argument. I defended Aristotle, and actually I think that the defense of slavery is very defensible on logical, argumentative, and textual terms. You can start throwing stones at me, but I'll stand the textual ground. What would be accomplished? Speed. We are doing everything too fast. We learn too fast, we graduate too fast, we write too fast, we speak to each other too fast, and we struggle too fast. How is the state going to wither away as a result of such practices? I don't know. Okay, very quickly. See the problem of history. I have heard people, George, you made a distinction in Ellen, and he'll make it, between Socrates and Plato. I ask you, with all, how do you know? How do you know? How does anyone know, based on the historical evidence, what the historical Socrates was like, when the bulk of this information comes from Plato's dialogues, which are known for anything but their historical accuracy? Socrates is a character, and actually sometimes caricatured, as in the Parmenides, in Plato's dialogues. How do you know what he was like? Plato gives you this information. How do you know that Plato doesn't give you, in some distorted form, information about himself, partially so through Socrates? This is one thing. The second thing I wanted to say, very quickly, is that politics is the expression of interest, George, you said, in context of the alienated form of the state. Let's go fast forward. Communist society. Will there be no delegation? No delegation of authority from any form of association of free producers? Will they be able to perform each function that their egalitarian society requires by themselves individually and on the spot? Will there be nothing like, if not a state, some kind of regulative mechanism of the distribution of power, equal distribution, and the maintenance of this 1 minute, I don't know, 1 minute. I want to acknowledge my other teacher in this room, Steve Newman. Steve, I can't say many things about you, and I have a lot of good things to say, but actually I go to my point number 7, which I never got to make in the opening statement. Actually, I wanted to ask the question for all of us, what is teaching? And why the question, what is teaching, might be of assistance in approaching the question with which we are purportedly dealing with today. What is the best methodological approach to understanding political theory texts, ancient texts? Marxists have happily acknowledged Aristotle's contribution to Marxist fundamentals. Where have I been? And I have not met these Marxists yet, with the exception of Marx himself. Richard Miller, who is an analytical Marxist, would have not much following here. Andrew Collier, one of the originally in good company with Alex Kallinikos and the International Socialists, but then going a very different direction. Scott Makeley, above all, with the most excellent perhaps, Marxist analysis of Aristotle's theory of exchange. Okay, what else? David, the Parmenides, how does it help us? How does what you told us from the Parmenides, that the Parmenides makes the point, this dialogue of Plato, that actually I'd like to pay, to advertise and pay someone or many people to help me understand it, especially the second part, but okay.
Stefanos, there'll be another time.
Yes, of course.
Maybe we can do concluding remarks from each of the panelists, and then we can get democratic and have a Q&A that involves everybody. Do I have the assent of the panelists for that strategy?
We could even just wrap it up before take our closing remarks
I think
before we
we
go
can.
for a break.
Yeah.
If you want to make that.
It's just, I feel terrible. I like speaking. Maybe that means I like listening to myself, but I don't feel good. I don't feel good doing it in the presence of so many people. No, people's time, I don't take for granted. I have already.
Stefanos, save it for your concluding remarks.
Yeah.
Okay, so if indeed that's the case, then how about I give each person 5 minutes in their concluding remarks. You can conclude however you would like to, as a guideline, perhaps a summary of what you thought of the discussion so far, as a means of sort of leading us into the Q&A period after the break. And I guess we might as well go in the order with which we started the introductory remarks. So, George, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, it's a little bit of a challenge to find a point to the concluding remarks. I think we've explored some issues meaningfully. At the same time, in a profound sense, we haven't actually, I think, identified something on which we've come to a resolution, or at least a specific point to agree to disagree. Perhaps that'll become clearer in question and answer. What I would say right now, first, with response to Stefanos' final point on Aristotelian, on Marx and Aristotle. Actually, a former York student, grad currently at St. Louis University, or whatever the name of the University in St. Louis is, Ruth Groff, is doing work on...
I forgot about it.
Yes.
I
The necessity of recognizing the Aristotelian metaphysic in coming to terms with Marx. Not an area of my great specialization, but she's really a philosopher. So, where do I stand by way of wrapping up here? I actually think that it's important to recognize that the approach that I take sees the first working out in the first form of Western class society of fundamental issues that continue to resonate today. And these issues largely have to do with how do we structure society for it to be more just, better. Now, one of the great problems is that you cannot make the state just. You can only get rid of it. It is the case, obviously, that humans will continue always to need some form of interaction, some forms of cooperation, some forms even of administration. And one of the things notoriously in Marx, or not in Marx specifically, is an answer as to what communist society will exactly look like. It is even conceivable that in the long march to take what will be clearly socialist and to make it truly communist, well, it'll turn out that that march goes on forever. I don't think it'll go on forever. I think the state will wither away. Perhaps there will remain a tiny husk of it somewhere. But I do think it's actually possible for human beings, we are ultimately rational and social, I think it's possible for us to organize ourselves in forms in which nobody uses a club to beat up anybody else, ever. And that people who do that will be seen as mentally ill, and some form of appropriate therapy will be applied so they don't harm themselves or others. We'll get rid of the state. I think that's possible. I don't think it's going to happen soon. And I don't think it's going to happen soon after a revolution. I do think it's possible. And that's what I want. I want to live a society in which all forms of alienation have been eliminated so that we deal with each other as free, rational human beings, each with the freedom to be as idiosyncratic as we want, but also working together, because that's what social beings do. So the problem is the state as the realization of inequalities in power, including wealth. The taking away, alienation of labor, the taking away of what is produced by one person by another, typically using it against the first person. Most societies for the last 10,000 years have had 80% of the population work and 20% basically not work. Sometimes it's been much more unequal even than that. It's been 95%, 5%. That is wrong, I believe. People should not exist off the labor of others. This is what was discovered to be an issue in Athens, beginning with Solon and continuing through to the realization of a remarkably effective democracy in the 4th century. One of the things that Neil and Ellen pointed out is that there's a profound bias in favor of seeing Athens as degenerate, declining after the Peloponnesian War. Whereas in fact, in the 4th century, the democracy was more law-abiding, really focused upon the centrality of issues of justice, and there was no longer the systematic effort to overthrow that democracy that there had been. It took Alexander, finally, to do that.
Antipater.
Yes, I know. Okay. The Macedonians.
Yes.
I want my time back, Stephanos. So, simple point. The ancients opened up what is still ongoing, a legacy of asking, why is there no justice, or not enough justice, and what can we do about it? And I think that is what still remains the case, why we should read Plato and Aristotle. We can't read Socrates, and hopefully learn something.
Thank you. David.
Well, again, I just want to thank you for inviting me here. It's a privilege to be back here at York and to be able to speak in front of you. Marx says, as you correctly quote, that we need to engage in the ruthless criticism of all that exists. But he also says that if truth could be read off appearance, we wouldn't need scientists. So Marx is, it is true that we must be critical of all that exists, but it is also true that being critical of all that exists is not a simple matter. It is not the case that the truth presents itself to us immediately and unproblematically in our subjective being. It is something that must be labored for, as Plato understood. In the metaphor of the cave, we reach our salvation moment through the hard labor of study. What Plato is offering us is a critical insight into the complexity of thinking out the truth in social forms and in social moments of contradiction and complexity, that we can cut through the husk of appearance to that which is true. This, of course, is not a popular view to hold these days, because the dominant philosophical position is that there is no difference between husk and kernel, that the sophistic position has resurrected itself. And for that reason, and many others, I find myself in a lonely position of advocating in favor of Plato, not only because there is the criticism made of him about the possible class bias and so on, but also overwhelmingly because Plato was rejected on philosophical grounds. And I think there is a still important and significant philosophical tradition which starts in Plato and in Aristotle and passes through St. Bonaventura, for example, and goes through Hegel, and I would also argue in Marx, and we see it in Roy Bhaskar and so on in present day, and Whitehead and so on. And that we really need in our political thinking to not only have the correct political ideology and the correct understanding about the programmatic tasks which await us, but beyond that, we need to be able to have to understand that political engagement is ultimately grounded in philosophical perspectives, and is ultimately a form of philosophical inquiry. And I think Plato has much to offer us for that.
Thank you. Stefanos.
Thank you, George and David, for being so kind to me today so far, because the day is not over and the meeting is not over. Actually, I may get quite a few more punches. I will duck though. Okay. Yeah, it's difficult. See the difficulties. This was very speedy, and it will be soon be over. We will not see each other again, and at best, a repetition of these things. You may be, since you are, registered students or faculty, you may see a few more times in your life, and we live our alienated existences even in education and learning. I think that in terms of Plato, the thing is this. And if one wants to approach Plato philosophically, one would have no choice but detect the distinction in the relationship between form and content. Content being the substantive philosophical argument, whatever shape it takes, coming out of the mouth of carefully constructed fictional characters, who most of the time do not speak by means of philosophical argument. You hear all these kinds of myths coming out of even Socrates' mouth. He tries to imitate Aesop. He is trying to make fables. He tells us the day of his death, awaiting his execution in his cell in Plato's Phaedo. Go figure, I don't understand this stuff. But so you have people talking, and Hegel and the Marxists, at least those who are philosophically inclined in a Hegelian direction, and that's not the only philosophical inclination that is open to Marxists, recognize that Hegel did something with the distinction between form and content. He identified problems keeping them apart. If we take, let's say, our clue from this, let's ask this question. Is there no possibility of any intricate link whatsoever between the form of Plato's writing, which is not prose, it's not direct communication, it's indirect, it's dialogue between some characters, many of whom have existed, but presented to us in ways that are wholly Plato's creations, and the philosophical argument. Is there no link? Because if there is no link, then it would be very easy to look through the dialogue form transparently and with more or less careful study, which is what else? Repetition upon repetition upon repetition over a long period of time of reading. But you can do that without posing some questions. And if you don't pose some questions, I don't know how much careful study will help anyone coming up with answers to fixing some problems. The second problem with Plato is, why do the characters spend so much time mythologizing? I mean, you're telling us things that they don't believe in and that they know to be factually untrue. What is the point? Also, out of the 30 or so works of Plato, have you looked at the titles? How come all but 6 of them are named after the proper name of somebody? Ευθύρπο, Gorgias, Protagoras, Meno, Menexenus, Ευθύδημος, Lysis, Lachis, Charmidis, Critias, Timius, Cratylus, proper names, Theaetetus, Parmenides. What is the idea? Unless of course it is simply something that can be treated as the literary freedom of the author. The other thing is, we are only touching, and there is no other option, the tip of the iceberg. This is why it's so difficult, and for something to come out of this. But speed and the format are the main culprits. But I have to say something about George's work and Ellen's and Neil Good's. I have to say that I'm very enthusiastic about it. I definitely welcome their contribution. My only suggestion, based on what I have read, is greater self-reflexivity. The ruthless criticism of every text should equally apply to Marx's and Ellen's and George's and Neil's texts, because if Ellen, whose scrutiny is supposed to have any real meaning, it should be Ellen who's to all, including herself. And the second thing is that, yes, the approach, I think, will make and can make a very useful contribution, historical context, but that does not mean that it is necessarily done well every time that it is done. 30 seconds. Okay, let me go to page C, speed is terrible. Page 66, and I read here that Plato visited Syracuse both under Dionysius I and his successor Dionysius II, with whom the philosopher fell out. What could be a more simple historical event to ascertain and to use in our attempt to understand Plato than his trips to Syracuse and to Sicily? But, obviously, you know something that I don't. Who said that Plato went to Sicily, or that he ever set foot out of Athens? Please tell me.
Okay, I would like to thank our panelists for our participation. Thanks very much, very stimulating. So what I'm going to suggest, it's 1:50 now, I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break. At 1:55 sharp, Chronos strikes again. And we'll resume what we're doing here, and at that point, we'll open it up to Q&A for whoever wants to participate.